The city never slept, but its darkest corners were wide awake. Neon lights flickered like broken promises, painting shadows on wet asphalt. Sirens wailed in the distance, not out of urgency, but as a lullaby of chaos that the streets had long since learned to ignore. In a towering glass building overlooking the slums, a group of sharply dressed lawyers gathered in a room that smelled of leather chairs, power, and arrogance. They weren't here for justice. They weren't here for truth. They were here to win, and to win big. "We needed a face the jury would forget," said Chambers, the one with the most expensive watch and the coldest eyes. "And we found one." He tossed a thin case file onto the polished table. On its cover was a mugshot of a 17-year-old black boy, tired eyes, a split lip, defiance still burning somewhere deep in his stare. A nobody. At least, that's what they thought. "A shoplifting charge," another lawyer scoffed. "Some street kid who couldn't keep his hands to himself. This one's perfect." "He's not even asking for a lawyer," said the intern, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doesn't matter," Chambers replied. "That's what makes him useful. He's scared, alone. He won't fight. He'll fold before we even get started." Laughter echoed around the room, dry, calculated, merciless. They were predators dressed in tailored suits, circling a kill that hadn't even bled yet. But what none of them knew was that the boy they dismissed as a pawn was about to become the storm that would unravel their entire game. In another part of the city, behind a rusted holding cell door, Malik stared at the cracked ceiling. He heard the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the mocking voices of the guards. His wrists ached from the cuffs. His face still throbbed from the arrest. But in his silence, something was building. Not fear, not even anger. Something colder, something sharper. They thought they had found a victim. What they had awakened was something else entirely. The courtroom was colder than the holding cell, not in temperature, but in spirit. It reeked of bleach, paper, and something far worse: judgment. Not justice, judgment. The kind that had already been passed before the trial ever began. Malik stood at the entrance, his wrists still red from the cuffs they had only just removed. The bailiff didn't bother looking at him as he motioned for him to step forward. Whispers buzzed like hornets the moment Malik crossed the threshold. Suits turned, eyes narrowed, and then came the laughter, hushed, mocking, cruel. "Look at him. Probably can't even spell defendant," one of the interns muttered under his breath, earning a chuckle from a nearby paralegal. "Should have kept his hands where they belong, back in the ghetto," another voice said, not even bothering to whisper. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the room already had its own order. Malik wasn't a person here. He was a symbol, a target, a young black boy in oversized clothes, staring at walls built long before he was born. They didn't need to hear his story. They had already written it for him. He stood alone, assigned no attorney, no family in the room. Only silence clung to him like a second skin. But behind his stillness wasn't fear, not anymore. It was calculation. His heartbeat drummed like war. His breathing was steady, even as shame tried to claw at him, as the weight of their eyes dug into his spine. But he didn't look down. Not once. He scanned the room slowly, deliberately, memorizing faces. Every smirk, every narrowed eye, every dismissive look. He was recording it all. One of the senior lawyers leaned over to Chambers and whispered, "He's just a kid. This won't take long." Chambers didn't respond. He was watching Malik. Something in the boy's expression made him pause. Not fear, not submission, but something else. Defiance. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and the judge finally walked in, robed, aged, and heavy with indifference. The room stood, then sat, and the performance began. They read the charges with theatrical detachment: petty theft, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. Malik kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. They read them again, slowly, as if trying to make sure he could understand the big words. When asked if he wished to speak, Malik hesitated. Every voice in his head screamed, "Stay quiet." That's what they expected. That's what they wanted. For him to stutter, to mumble, to fall apart. That would seal the deal. An uneducated, angry black boy who couldn't handle pressure. Instead, Malik stepped forward, one foot in front of the other. His shoes echoed across the courtroom like a challenge. "I want to represent myself," he said, his voice low but firm. Gasps, murmurs, laughter again, but this time with an edge of discomfort. Chambers leaned back in his chair, smiling with condescension. "Let him. This will be quicker than I thought." But in that moment, something shifted. Malik may not have known law, but he knew the streets, he knew people, he knew eyes, and most of all, he knew what it felt like to be nothing in a room full of people who thought they were everything. What none of them realized was that Malik didn't come to survive this trial. He came to dismantle it. The courtroom felt like a theater, but not the kind that revered talent. This was something else entirely. A stage for the powerful, the rich, and the untouchable, where people's lives were reduced to mere entertainment. The lawyers strutted about, rehearsing their lines, adjusting their suits, and glancing at one another in practiced confidence. To them, this wasn't a trial. It was a show, a game. Chambers was the star. He knew it. The moment Malik stepped up to represent himself, Chambers' lips curled into a tight smile. This was the kind of thing that made a name. This boy, this poor, uneducated child, was no match for the polished machines of the legal world. He was a prop, a tragic spectacle. "You're wasting our time," Chambers sneered, stepping up to the podium with all the arrogance of someone who knew that the system would bend to his will. "But very well, let's play along." He turned to the jury, his voice smooth and rehearsed, as he began painting a picture of Malik's supposed criminality. The words came like poison from his mouth, each accusation dripping with venom. A young man from the wrong side of town, no father in the picture, likely raised on the streets, he said, letting the words hang in the air. A thief, a menace to society. The jury nodded, some of them exchanging knowing glances. They weren't just hearing the words. They were seeing the image. A black boy, dark skin and ragged clothes. A boy who clearly didn't belong in this room with people who wore power like a second skin. Chambers paused for a moment, letting the moment sink in before continuing. But this is not just about theft, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. This is about respect, about teaching the youth of this generation that there are consequences, that they can't just steal from others and expect to get away with it. Malik clenched his fists at his sides, but his face remained calm, a wall of stoic indifference. Every word that Chambers spat was a slap, but he refused to let it show. He refused to let them see the hurt they were so eager to impose. The defense, or rather, the prosecution dressed in defense, performed with a detached precision. It wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about making Malik seem less human, less worthy of a fair trial. They portrayed him as an animal, a product of his environment, incapable of making choices beyond the ones that would inevitably lead him down a dark path. And yet, in their pursuit of spectacle, they underestimated the power of a single glance. Malik had been quiet, until now. As Chambers made his dramatic closing argument, leaning over the podium, fixing the jury with a triumphant gaze, Malik stood up, his voice cutting through the thick air like a knife. "I didn't steal anything. And you don't get to decide who I am," he said, his voice low but filled with a strength that caught the entire room off guard. The lawyers, especially Chambers, had expected him to crumble. They'd expected him to bow his head, to stammer, to be their plaything. They hadn't anticipated this. The steady resolve in his words, the way he met each sneer with a challenge in his eyes. Chambers' smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but it quickly returned, more condescending than before. "Oh, I see," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're better than this, huh? You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" Malik didn't flinch. The courtroom watched in hushed silence as he held his ground. The lawyers tried to make a spectacle out of him, but the boy was no longer the one on trial. They were, "You have no idea what I'm capable of," Malik said quietly, but every syllable felt like a crack in the armor they had worked so hard to build. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to freeze. The tension hung thick in the air, a palpable thing that could be tasted on the back of their tongues. The jury shifted uneasily, their certainty beginning to waver. The other lawyers looked at each other, then at Chambers. He tried to laugh it off, but there was a slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his papers. The cracks in his confidence were showing. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a battle for control, for power, and for respect. Malik wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was dismantling everything they thought they knew about him, about his place in this world. They tried to turn his life into a joke. They tried to make him a villain. But as the seconds ticked by, it was clear. Malik wasn't just going to play along. He was going to rewrite the rules. The courtroom had become a battlefield, but not for the reasons most people expected. This wasn't just a trial about theft or defiance. No, it had become something darker. A savage game where every word, every accusation, was a weapon meant to strip Malik of his dignity, his humanity. Chambers leaned forward, his voice smooth and chilling as he made his next move. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's not pretend this is about a simple misunderstanding. This is about a young man from a place where people like him belong, a place where crime is bred, where values are non-existent, where families are broken." He allowed those words to linger in the air, heavy with implications. His words dripped with condescension, a smugness that clung to him like cologne. The room reacted with slight nods, as if they had already heard the narrative. "They say you can't change your roots," Chambers continued, turning his eyes to Malik. "Where you come from always catches up to you, doesn't it, Malik? Even when you try to hide behind a facade. But you can't hide who you really are. You are, and always will be, a product of your environment." The jury didn't blink, and it was clear that Chambers had successfully painted Malik's race, his skin color, as the root of his supposed crime. He wasn't just accused of theft. He was accused of being born in the wrong place, to the wrong people. He was accused of existing. Malik felt the burn of their eyes on him, the searing weight of their judgment. The words sank into his skin like daggers, sharp and cruel. His chest tightened and the urge to flee, to run far away from this place, was almost overwhelming. But he didn't. He wouldn't. Not now. He could feel the tears threatening to rise, but he refused to let them fall. The heat of the courtroom, the sweat on his brow, the anger building inside him. It all became a white noise. This wasn't just about the accusations anymore. This was a battle for his very essence, his humanity. "Where are your parents, Malik?" Chambers' voice sliced through his thoughts. "Where is your family? Where's the man who should have taught you right from wrong?" Malik's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let them break him. He wasn't going to let them make him believe the lies they had been telling for generations, that he wasn't enough, that he didn't matter, that his life could be reduced to nothing more than the sum of his skin color and his zip code. "Let me tell you, folks," Chambers continued, as if he had already won. "This is a kid who believes the world owes him something. That's the problem. People like him always think they can take without giving back. But that's the way of the streets, isn't it?" Each word hit Malik like a slap to the face, and each time he kept his head high. The humiliation burned, but it fueled him. He wasn't going to let them turn his skin, his heritage, into a reason for his downfall. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but they didn't flinch. They were too wrapped up in the story that had been fed to them. A boy, a black boy, a troubled boy, a dangerous boy. He had become the embodiment of every stereotype they'd ever been told. But Malik wasn't the story they thought he was. He wasn't just the kid who was supposed to fold, who was supposed to shrink into the shadows. He was the one who would rewrite the script, break free from the chains they tried to lock him in. The lawyer turned to the jury one last time, eyes cold, face painted with false sympathy. "We can't let a young man like Malik walk free, not just because of what he's done, but because of what he represents. We can't have our streets filled with more of them." The words hit Malik like a punch in the gut, and for a moment it seemed like the entire room held its breath, waiting for him to crack, to collapse under the weight of it all. But instead, Malik stood taller. The insults, the racism, the hatred, they only made him stronger. "I didn't steal," Malik said, his voice a low growl, "and you don't get to make me a villain just because you're scared of who I am." The courtroom went silent. Malik's words hung in the air like smoke. His eyes locked onto Chambers with a steady, unwavering gaze. They wanted him to break. But he wasn't going to. Not now. Not ever. Because this wasn't just about freedom. This was about his worth, his dignity, and they weren't going to take that from him. Days passed, the trial dragging on like a twisted performance, with each session more agonizing than the last. What had started as an idealistic and somewhat naive attempt to fight for his innocence was slowly morphing into something darker for Malik. The courtroom had become a place where not only his future was at stake, but his very soul. It wasn't enough to prove that he hadn't stolen anything. No, this battle was deeper. The lawyer's attacks grew sharper, more personal, more vile. Chambers had become increasingly frustrated. His smirk had faded, replaced with a look of irritation and contempt. He couldn't understand why Malik wasn't folding. It was a puzzle that he couldn't solve. The kid, this poor, ignorant boy from the wrong side of the tracks, should have been cowering by now, trembling under the weight of their accusations. Yet here he stood, eyes unyielding, mind sharp. With every false accusation, every racial slur, Malik stood tall, unbroken. During one session, Chambers stepped forward with a cold grin, holding up a piece of paper for the jury to see. "Here we have something interesting," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A letter from Malik's so-called mentor, a man from the neighborhood who calls himself a role model. I want to read it for you." He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "To whom it may concern, this young man is nothing but a product of his environment. He's a troublemaker, a liar, and a thief. I warned you about him, but you didn't listen. He'll never change. No matter how much help you give him, he'll always be a menace to society." The letter, signed by a man who had been one of Malik's mentors in the past, was a crushing blow. It felt like a betrayal, a reminder that the very people who were supposed to guide him had abandoned him, just like everyone else. But the worst part wasn't the letter itself. It was the way Chambers read it, the way his words oozed with satisfaction as if he had just discovered a golden ticket. Malik's jaw tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to defend himself against the lies that were being told about him. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. His mind raced, a storm of thoughts crashing against each other. What if they were right? What if this battle was too big for him? What if they were going to make an example out of him? A black boy from the wrong side of the tracks, who didn't know his place in the world. The jury was silent, listening intently. Chambers turned to them, eyes glinting with triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said with a malicious edge in his voice, "this is the reality. This is the kind of person we are dealing with. A boy who, no matter how many chances he's given, will always return to his old ways." The jury members exchanged glances, some nodding, others looking away. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as though the weight of their collective judgment was pressing down on Malik's shoulders. He could feel it, the crushing sense of inevitability. They had already decided. He was the villain. He was the criminal. But something inside him shifted. Malik's mind, previously clouded with doubt, began to clear. This was no longer just about defending his innocence. It was about proving something much bigger, that he was not a product of his environment, that his worth was not defined by his past or the color of his skin. He had a voice. He had a mind. He had a will to fight, and that would be his weapon. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. Chambers sneered, but Malik's gaze remained unbroken. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice steady and strong, louder than it had been before. You all want me to be the criminal. You want to label me, to reduce me to nothing more than the color of my skin, the place I come from. But I'm not just some statistic. I'm not some label you can slap on me and expect me to disappear. Chambers took a step forward, ready to retort, but Malik didn't back down. You say I'm a thief. You say I'm a liar, but you've never bothered to listen. You've never bothered to understand. You think you can break me with your words, with your prejudices, with your assumptions. But you're wrong. Malik paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, hanging on every syllable. You see, what you're really afraid of isn't me. It's the idea that I might actually be something more than what you've decided I am. I'm not a victim. I'm not some criminal waiting to be thrown away. I'm a human being, and I won't let you erase that. The courtroom was tense. The lawyers, the judge, the jury. They were all on edge, unsure of how to respond. Chambers stood still for a moment, his arrogance momentarily faltering. But then he smirked, his lips curling into a mockingly sympathetic expression. How touching, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But you're still just a kid who doesn't know better. You don't understand what it means to face the consequences of your actions. You don't know what real responsibility is, and that's why you'll never get out of this. Malik's pulse quickened. It was clear now. This wasn't just a battle for his freedom. It was a battle for his dignity, his humanity. The people in this room wanted to strip him of everything, to reduce him to a stereotype, to make him into a monster. But he couldn't. He wouldn't let them. You don't get to tell me who I am, Malik said, his voice calm but unwavering. You don't get to decide my future based on where I come from or how I look. I'm not some criminal you can lock away and forget. I will fight for myself, for my right to exist, to be seen as something more than what you've made me out to be. Chambers sneered again, clearly annoyed by Malik's defiance. But there was something in his eyes now, something that betrayed his confidence. Malik could see it. The cracks were starting to show. The more he spoke, the more the lawyer's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. I'm not afraid of you, Malik continued, looking directly at Chambers. You're not the one who gets to define my life. I'm not going to sit here and let you destroy me with your lies, your hate, and your ignorance. Chambers looked at the jury, his expression hardening. This is exactly the problem. This attitude, this refusal to take responsibility. It's why people like Malik end up on the streets. They think they can talk their way out of everything, but the reality is, they can't. The judge interrupted, his voice stern. Enough, Mr. Chambers. This is not the time for personal attacks. Let's stick to the evidence. But it was clear. The damage had been done. Chambers had shown his hand, and Malik knew it. The lawyer had made it clear. This wasn't about the truth. It wasn't about justice. It was about power, about control, about crushing anyone who dared to defy the system. Malik felt the weight of the room pressing in on him, but he refused to back down. His heart was pounding, his mind sharp and focused. He had made his stand, and no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them win. The trial had reached a boiling point, the tension so thick that you could almost taste it. With every passing day, Malik had been subjected to relentless attacks, not just on his character, but on his very humanity. The lawyers were relentless, and they had succeeded in doing something no one had anticipated. They had pushed him to the edge. But what they didn't understand was that they had underestimated him from the start. They had treated him like a pawn in a game they thought they could control, not realizing that Malik wasn't here to play by their rules. It all came to a head in the middle of the session, a moment that no one saw coming. Malik had spent the last several days listening, observing, taking in their every word, their every tactic. But the constant barrage of insults, the racial slurs, the systematic attempts to break him down had taken its toll. He could feel his resolve beginning to crack. The weight of their expectations, their assumptions, was starting to take hold. They thought they had won. They thought they had him. And then something inside him shifted. The moment came when the defense attorney one of the most arrogant and condescending lawyers in the room, leaned over the table and shot Malik a smug smile. Tell me, Malik, do you even understand the gravity of the charges against you? Or are you too lost in your own world, too consumed by your own self-righteousness to see the reality of your situation? The words hit Malik like a slap. He could feel the contempt in the air, the way they all looked at him, the unspoken assumption that he was just some ignorant, angry black kid who couldn't possibly understand the implications of his actions. They were trying to reduce him to nothing more than a stereotype, to make him feel small, insignificant, unworthy of the space he occupied in that courtroom. For a moment, Malik could feel his breath catch in his throat, the anger rising like a wave. He had to fight it, had to keep it contained. But he could feel the flood of words building inside him, waiting to explode. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and the entire room fell silent. The courtroom had been filled with murmurs, whispers, the constant sound of rustling papers. But in that moment, it all stopped. Everyone was watching him. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, expecting him to fall apart. They thought he would break under the pressure, just like they always expected of someone like him. But what they didn't know was that he had been quietly building up his strength. He had been listening to every word, every insult, and now he was ready. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not ever. Malik looked at the defense attorney, his gaze unwavering. "I understand exactly what's happening here," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "You think you can break me, right? You think that by throwing your accusations, your assumptions, your racism at me, I'll cower and crumble. But you're wrong." The attorney scoffed, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "Oh, I think you're the one who's wrong, Malik. You're in over your head here. You don't belong in this room." The words stung. But Malik wasn't backing down. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was taking back his dignity, his power. "I don't belong in this room," Malik repeated, his voice growing louder. "Is that what you think? You think I don't belong because of the color of my skin, because of where I come from? You think I don't belong because you can't understand me, because you can't see me for who I really am?" The defense attorney's face twitched, but Malik didn't stop. He could see it now. The cracks in their armor, the confidence that they had displayed for so long was starting to falter. "You know what's funny?" Malik continued. "You're so focused on trying to tear me down, to make me feel like nothing, to make me think that I'm less than you, that you don't even realize something. You don't even see how much power you're giving me by trying to destroy me. You don't see how much strength I've gained by surviving all of this, all of your hate, your ignorance, your cruelty." He could feel the energy in the room shift, the uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Malik took a step closer to the table, his voice growing more intense with every word. "I've been sitting here, listening to you, listening to all of you tell me that I'm nothing, that I'm a product of my environment, that I'll never be anything more than a thug, a criminal, a stereotype. And I've stayed quiet because I knew that if I said anything, you'd just use it against me. But I'm done with that. I'm done being quiet. I'm done letting you tell me who I am." The defense attorney's smug smile had faded. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wasn't prepared for this. None of them were. "You call me a criminal," Malik said, his voice sharp, almost cutting. "You call me a liar. You make me out to be some thug from the streets. But you don't get to define me. You don't get to make me feel small. You don't get to strip me of my humanity just because I don't look like you." The entire courtroom was watching, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Malik felt a surge of power. He could see it in their eyes. The uncertainty, the hesitation, the attorneys, the judge, the jury. They were all watching him, and they weren't sure how to react. "You want to call me a product of my environment?" Malik continued, his voice rising with intensity. "Fine, but let me tell you something. I'm not a product of anything except my own will. I don't need your pity. I don't need your sympathy. I don't need your approval. What I need is for you to stop trying to make me feel like I'm less than you, because I'm not." The defense attorney took a step back, visibly flustered. He opened his mouth, but still no words came out. Chambers, who had been watching from the sidelines, leaned forward, his usual smug expression faltering. Malik turned toward the jury, his eyes locking onto each one. "You've been told who I am," he said, his voice steady. "You've been told what I am. But I'm not what they say. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a thug. I'm not a stereotype. I'm a person. I'm a human being. And I deserve the same respect as anyone else in this room." There was a long silence. The tension was palpable, thick enough to slice through. For the first time, Malik felt like he had taken control of the room. The weight that had been crushing him all this time, the weight of their expectations, their assumptions, their prejudices, was starting to lift. They had underestimated him. They had thought he was just another black kid from the wrong side of the tracks, an easy target, an easy victim. But they were wrong. Malik wasn't their victim. He wasn't their punching bag. He wasn't going to play the role they had cast for him. "I'm not here to beg for my freedom," Malik said, his voice now quiet but strong. "I'm here to prove that I am more than what you've made me out to be. I'm here to show you that I have the power to fight back. And I'm not going to stop. Not now. Not ever." Chambers stood frozen, his face betraying a mix of frustration and disbelief. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their uncertainty now fully visible. Malik had done it. He had shaken them, made them question everything they thought they knew about him. The defense attorney opened his mouth to say something, but the words failed him. Malik had won the moment. His words had been sharper than any argument, more powerful than any insult. And he had done it on his own terms. Malik turned and walked back to his seat, his back straight, his head held high. The courtroom was silent, every person in that room processing what had just happened. The battle had shifted, and Malik knew this was just the beginning. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It had become thick, heavy with an energy that wasn't just about Malik's trial anymore. No, the game had changed, and there was something far darker lurking beneath the surface. Malik had fought bravely, his words cutting through the air like blades, but the more he revealed, the more it became clear that the truth wasn't just being manipulated, it was being buried. It had always been about more than a petty theft charge. Behind every objection, every twist of the law, behind each attempt to strip Malik of his dignity, there was something far more insidious at play. The system was built on lies, designed to entrap people like him, people from his neighborhood, people who dared to challenge the boundaries that had been set for them from birth. And Malik, despite his courage, was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that the system had no intention of letting anyone solve. But Malik's fight had exposed cracks, and the cracks were beginning to widen. It all started with a small, seemingly insignificant detail. In one of the sessions, a piece of evidence had been quietly dismissed. A letter, buried in the pile of paperwork, was ignored, not mentioned in the heat of the courtroom drama. Malik's defense team hadn't brought it up, but one of the lawyers on the prosecution side had slipped it into the court file early on. It wasn't until after Malik's powerful outburst that the defense began to dig deeper. What they found was troubling. A conspiracy so far-reaching, so entwined with the system, that it was almost too difficult to believe. The letter, it turned out, had been written by one of the key figures in the justice system, a person who had been manipulating the trial from the shadows. A high-ranking officer in the local police force, one who had deep ties with the district attorney's office, had orchestrated the entire case against Malik. The charges, the false accusations, the biased witnesses, all of it had been planned. This was never about justice. It was about control. Malik wasn't just a scapegoat. He was a pawn in a much larger game of power, control, and money. And the people who held the strings had no intention of letting him, or anyone else like him, get away. The truth was buried beneath layers of corruption. This wasn't just a case of racial prejudice. No, it was a story of systemic manipulation, a carefully constructed web of lies designed to keep people like Malik in their place. The day the letter was uncovered, Malik's lawyer, a woman who had been tirelessly working on his case, burst into the courtroom with the evidence. The room fell silent as she handed the judge the sealed envelope, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her words sharp but measured, "I request a full investigation into the origins of this case. This letter reveals corruption at the highest levels. The very people who should be ensuring justice are the ones who have been orchestrating this entire trial from the beginning." The judge's face went pale, his usual stern demeanor faltering for the briefest of moments. He quickly regained his composure, but Malik saw the hesitation in his eyes. The wheels of the system, the gears that had been grinding him down, were beginning to turn too fast for them to control. For a moment, there was silence. Then the prosecutor, a man whose polished appearance had always made him seem untouchable, stood up abruptly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, this is preposterous," he said, his eyes darting between Malik and his attorney. "There is no evidence to support these claims. This is an attempt to derail the trial." But Malik's attorney wasn't finished. "The letter has been authenticated, and the officer who wrote it has connections with the district attorney's office. This entire trial, from the beginning, has been a sham." The prosecutor's confident facade was cracking. For the first time in the trial, Malik could see the fear in his eyes. Fear that the entire system was about to collapse around them. "You think we didn't know this was happening?" Malik's attorney continued. "You think we didn't know that the police, the prosecutors, and the people in charge of this trial have been using it to advance their own personal agendas? You think we didn't see how they tried to bury the truth?" The words hit like a bombshell. The room was frozen, the weight of what was happening sinking in. Chambers, the prosecutor, had no response. His earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by a look of desperation. But Malik, even in the face of this revelation, couldn't allow himself to feel the satisfaction of victory just yet. The truth was finally coming to light, but at what cost? He knew that revealing this corruption would have consequences, both for him and for the people behind the conspiracy. The question now wasn't just whether he would walk free, it was whether anyone would be held accountable for what had happened to him. And that's when the whispers began. The whispers started from the back of the room, quiet at first, but growing louder as more people began to speak up. It was a ripple in the water, small at first, but expanding with every passing second. The public, the media, the onlookers who had been watching the trial from afar, began to ask questions. The truth was too big to ignore. The corruption, the lies, the manipulation. It couldn't be hidden anymore. But just as quickly as the truth began to surface, so did the obstacles. The system was designed to protect its own, to make sure that those at the top never faced the consequences of their actions. The media began to run with the story, but soon the narrative was twisted. The focus shifted away from the corruption at the heart of the case, and instead turned to the chaos in the courtroom. They portrayed Malik as a troublemaker, a boy who was defying the system, rather than the victim of that very system. The whispers of corruption were drowned out by the loud, shrill voices of those who wanted to protect their interests. The powerful figures who had orchestrated the case against Malik weren't going to let it all slip away so easily. They fought back, desperately trying to reassert control over the narrative. But even as the media turned against him, Malik didn't waver. He knew what was at stake. He knew that the truth was a luxury, one that very few could afford to embrace. But in that moment, as the fog of lies and corruption began to lift, he realized something even more important. The truth, though elusive, was his greatest weapon. And no matter how hard they tried to bury it, it was never going to stay hidden. For the first time, Malik saw the entire system for what it was. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the trial or the accusations. It was about power. It was about control. It was about keeping people like him in the dark, making sure they never knew the truth, never understood how deep the corruption ran. But Malik wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. The truth was no longer just his to tell. It was everyone's. And it was going to change everything. The trial continued, but the fight had already shifted. Malik wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been oppressed, for everyone who had been buried beneath the weight of the system's lies. He would bring the truth into the light, and nothing, no matter how powerful, would be able to stop him. The courtroom had become a battlefield, but Malik was no longer just defending himself. Each day, the pressure mounted, and with it, the intensity of the fight. It had started as a struggle for his freedom, but as the trial went on, it became something much more. Malik was no longer a passive participant in his own fate. He had turned the tables, and now he was on the offensive. Every moment in the courtroom felt like a battle. His words were no longer just a defense, they were a weapon, sharp and relentless. The system that had once seemed invincible now trembled under the force of his resolve. What began as a lone, unarmed teenager facing down a biased and oppressive judicial machine had morphed into something far more dangerous for the powerful forces stacked against him. The attacks on Malik were becoming more intense, more personal. The lawyers, once so confident in their positions, were now stumbling. It wasn't just Malik's innocence they were attacking anymore. No, it was his very existence, his will to live free of the chains they had tried to place on him from the moment he had entered the courtroom. They were throwing everything they had at him, every racist stereotype, every insult, every attempt to humiliate him. But Malik was no longer afraid. He was learning how to turn their weapons against them. One afternoon, in the heat of the trial, the prosecutor, Chambers, leaned over the table with a sly grin on his face. "You know, Malik," he began, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really do seem to think you're better than this, don't you? You think you're better than us, better than the system that's been working for years to keep people like you in line. But you're nothing more than a product of your environment. You're a thug, a criminal, nothing more." Malik stood up slowly, his body rigid with purpose. He didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Every word Chambers spoke only seemed to fuel the fire inside him. He had been called every name in the book: thug, animal, criminal. They had painted him as a stereotype. But now, as the heat of the battle grew, Malik realized something profound. He was not the one who needed to change. It was the system that was broken, and he was going to expose it for what it truly was. Malik's voice cut through the air with a sharpness that shocked everyone in the room. "You call me a thug, but you don't even know me. You don't know where I come from, what I've been through. You think you can reduce me to a label. You think you can make me feel like I'm worthless just because of the color of my skin. But I'm not the one who's broken here. The system is, and I'm here to show you just how deep the rot goes." Chambers tried to speak, but his words faltered. Malik's words had hit their mark, and for the first time in the trial, the prosecutor was thrown off balance. He stumbled over his next words, his arrogance replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The tension in the room grew thick. Malik wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was making a statement. His words, once simply a means of survival, had become a force of their own. With each passing moment, he grew bolder. The jury watched in silence, caught between the shock of Malik's sudden transformation and the realization that something much bigger was unfolding before their eyes. But Chambers wasn't going to give up so easily. He regained his composure and sneered, trying to assert control once more. "Oh, I'm sure the streets have taught you all sorts of lessons. You think you can talk your way out of this, Malik? You think you can turn your words into weapons? But at the end of the day, you're still just a kid with no future. No matter how many times you try to talk your way out of it, the truth is, you're guilty." But Malik wasn't done. His resolve only hardened in the face of Chambers' taunts. "You think you can judge me based on my past. You think you know who I am because of where I grew up or the color of my skin. You think that gives you the right to decide my future." Chambers took a step back, visibly frustrated. His composure was slipping, but Malik wasn't about to give him an inch. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, and he knew that this moment, this battle for his dignity, was something far more important than just this trial. It was a battle for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or oppressed. Here's the thing, Chambers, Malik continued, his voice calm but powerful. You and the system you represent want to paint me as a criminal. You want to use me as an example to prove that people like me don't belong in this world. But I'm not going to let you do that. You want me to be your scapegoat, your villain. Well, I'm not your villain. You're the villain in this story. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his face reddening with frustration. He could see that Malik wasn't just fighting back. He was reclaiming his power. He had gone from being a victim in their eyes to being the one in control of the narrative, and that terrified them. Malik wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was taking down the walls they had built around him, and in the process, he was exposing the cracks in the system that had been built to keep people like him down. I don't need your sympathy, Malik said, his voice steady and unwavering. I don't need your approval. You've tried to break me with your words, with your prejudice, with your assumptions. But here I am, standing tall, and I'm not going anywhere. You want to destroy me, but I'm not your puppet. I'm not the person you think I am, and I'm not going to let you control my fate. The prosecutor's face twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He wasn't prepared for this. He had expected Malik to fold, to crumble under the weight of their accusations. But instead, Malik had found a strength inside himself that was more powerful than anything they could throw at him. For the first time in the trial, the tables had turned. Malik wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was attacking the very system that had tried to destroy him. The courtroom, once a place of intimidation, had become a battlefield where Malik was no longer the underdog. He was the warrior. Every time you call me a criminal, Malik said, his voice rising with intensity, you're showing the world just how much you fear me. You fear the truth. You fear that I'm not the villain you've painted me to be. You fear that I'm not just a product of my environment. You fear that I'm more than that. You fear that I'm capable of breaking free from the chains you've tried to place around me. The prosecutor's face was now flushed with frustration. He could see it, the uncertainty that was creeping into the jury's minds. They were starting to question everything. Malik wasn't the one on trial anymore. The system was. I'm not afraid of you, Malik said, locking eyes with Chambers. I'm not afraid of your system. You think you can destroy me with your lies, with your assumptions, with your prejudice. But you're wrong. I've already won, and you're not going to stop me. The prosecutor stepped back, his arrogance faltering. He had underestimated Malik from the very beginning, and now, in front of the jury, in front of everyone who had been watching this case unfold, Malik had turned the tables. The tension in the room was palpable. The jury was silent, absorbed in the magnitude of what had just transpired. Malik's words had broken through their defenses, shattering their preconceived notions. For the first time in this trial, they weren't just seeing a teenager on trial, they were seeing the truth. Malik had not just defended himself, he had launched a counterattack. And now, the power was shifting. The courtroom, once a place of judgment, had become the place where Malik was writing his own story. A story that would inspire others, that would expose the cracks in a system that had tried to break him, and that would ignite a movement for change. This was no longer about a trial for Malik's freedom. This was about exposing the truth, about fighting for justice, and about dismantling a system that was built to keep people like him down. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. Malik wasn't going to let them win. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted once again, this time into something that no one had anticipated. Malik was no longer the victim. He was no longer the one on trial. No, the battle had transformed. The courtroom was now his battlefield, and every move, every word, was a calculated strike. The once untouchable forces that had been relentlessly hammering him down were now on the defensive. The system that had been built to destroy him was beginning to crack, and he, a young black boy, stood at the center of it, showing the world that he could not only survive, but fight back. Malik had been quiet for so long, enduring each racist attack, each personal insult with a steely silence. And then, when the time was right, he had unleashed his words with precision. The defense team had underestimated him, and now he was playing the game in ways they never saw coming. His attorney, who had been at his side since the beginning, watched with growing admiration as Malik dismantled the arguments of the opposition one by one. The tension in the room was thick as each word Malik spoke pierced the air. He wasn't just answering the accusations anymore. No, now he was dissecting the arguments of the defense, pointing out contradictions, revealing holes in their logic, and forcing them to face their own lies. His defense had become an attack, and for the first time in the trial, it was the prosecution that found itself scrambling. It was clear that the prosecutor, Chambers, was beginning to crack under the pressure. His calm exterior, the polished, smug demeanor he had worn for so long, was now a distant memory. Malik could see it in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Chambers had underestimated him from the start, and now it was too late to turn back. Chambers stood up, his hand shaking slightly as he adjusted his papers. He was trying to regain control, but Malik wasn't letting him. With each question, each rebuttal, Malik tightened the noose around him, exposing the flaws in the prosecution's case, showing the cracks in their carefully constructed lies. The defense team, once so confident, was now floundering. They had been so sure of their victory, so certain that they had Malik trapped. But now, they were grasping at straws, trying to deflect, trying to redirect the attention away from the weaknesses in their own case. It wasn't working, not anymore. Malik stood tall, his gaze unwavering, his voice steady but fierce. "You think you can intimidate me into silence, that your racist insults, your lies, will make me bow my head and give up," he said, addressing Chambers directly. "But you're wrong. You're wrong about me. You're wrong about who I am, and I'm here to show you exactly who's in control." The words stung, but Chambers couldn't answer back. Instead, he took a step back, clearly shaken. Malik's voice, steady and calm, cut through the noise like a blade. It was the first time in the trial that he had fully realized the power he held. This wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. This was about proving that he was more than what they had made him out to be. He wasn't just a victim. He was a force to be reckoned with. "You want to talk about who I am?" Malik continued, his voice growing stronger. "You want to call me a criminal, a thug, a menace to society. You think you can reduce me to that? You think you can make me fit into your little box of stereotypes just because of the color of my skin?" He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air for a moment. "Let me tell you something. You don't get to define me. You don't get to control my story." Chambers opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Malik wasn't finished. "You sit up there, pretending to be the voice of justice, but all I've seen from you is manipulation, lies, and the abuse of power," Malik said, his gaze never leaving Chambers' eyes. "You don't care about justice. You care about control. You care about maintaining a system that's built to keep people like me in their place. You think you've won because you've labeled me as a criminal. But I'm not the one who's guilty here. You are." The words echoed through the room, and Malik could feel the weight of them settle on the shoulders of everyone present. The prosecutor, once so confident, was now visibly shaken. He opened and closed his mouth, struggling to regain his composure, but it was too late. Malik had taken the upper hand. The jury was silent, watching the two men face off. Malik could see the doubt creeping into their minds. He could feel the shift in the room. They had come into this trial believing the prosecution's narrative, the narrative of a young black boy from the wrong side of the tracks who had turned to crime. But now, that narrative was beginning to unravel. "You think I'm a criminal because of where I come from, because of the color of my skin," Malik continued, his voice unwavering. "But I'm here to show you that I'm not the person you've tried to make me out to be. I'm here to show you that the system you've built is flawed, that it's corrupt, that it's broken. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." The room was silent, save for the sound of Malik's voice as he continued to speak with unwavering confidence. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing the flaws in the system, The lies that had been fed to everyone, the injustices that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The prosecutor finally stepped forward, but this time, his voice was not filled with the same arrogance it once had. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaky, "this is not the place for personal attacks. We are here to discuss the facts of the case." Malik didn't back down. "This is the case," he said, his voice cutting through the prosecutor's feeble attempts to regain control. "This is about the facts, the truth that you've tried so hard to bury, the truth that you've been feeding to the jury all along, trying to make them believe your lies. But I'm not going to let you." Chambers' face turned crimson with rage. He pointed a finger at Malik, but Malik didn't flinch. "You can't handle the truth," Malik said, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge. "You've spent your whole life trying to control people like me. You think that because you wear a suit and sit behind a desk, you can control my future. But you're wrong. You don't get to decide who I am. I decide that. I will decide what happens to me. And this trial ends with me walking free." The courtroom was dead silent. For the first time, Malik had completely turned the tables. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his victory, was now stammering, unable to respond to the force of Malik's words. He had thrown everything at Malik: insults, racism, lies. But Malik had taken it all and turned it back on him. The defense lawyer, watching from the sidelines, couldn't hide the admiration in her eyes. She had seen Malik grow from a scared, uncertain boy into a powerful force. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for something much bigger. He was fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been pushed down by a system that didn't care about them. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The jury was still. The judge sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowed in thought. Malik had exposed the truth, not just about himself, but about the entire system. And for the first time, the wheels of that system were beginning to grind to a halt. Malik stood tall, his eyes locked onto the prosecutor, and said, "You've lost. This trial isn't about me anymore. It's about all of us. It's about standing up against a system that's been broken for too long. And no matter what happens here today, I've already won." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The trial was no longer about the charges against Malik. It was about the truth, and Malik had made sure everyone knew it. The tables had turned. And in that moment, he wasn't just defending himself. He was taking control of his future, and he was forcing the system to face the consequences of its actions. Malik wasn't just a victim anymore. He was the victor. The courtroom was on the verge of chaos. What had started as a simple trial had now transformed into a battleground where more than just a young boy's future was at stake. Malik stood tall, his eyes locked onto the jury, his voice unwavering despite the intense pressure. He had spent the last weeks defending himself, exposing the cracks in the system, and now he was about to deliver his final blow. The room was heavy with anticipation. Chambers, the prosecutor who had once been so confident, now stood before the judge, clearly on edge. His smugness had long since evaporated, replaced by visible frustration and desperation. His previous attempts to intimidate Malik had failed, and now, it was clear to everyone, the tide had turned. But it wasn't just the facts that had shifted. It was Malik's resolve, his intelligence, and his unshakable belief in his own worth. As the trial entered its final moments, Malik's defense became more than just a legal argument. It became a profound statement about the resilience of the human spirit. The young boy, who had once been seen as nothing more than a stereotype, a criminal in the making, was now standing before them as something far greater, a force capable of tearing down the walls of the system that had sought to crush him. Malik's voice broke through the tension in the room, steady and clear. "You've used every tactic to make me feel small, to make me feel like I don't belong here," he said, addressing the jury. "You've tried to make me believe that my past, my skin color, my background define who I am. You've called me a criminal, a threat to society, but I'm here to tell you that I'm none of those things. I am more than your labels. I am more than what you've tried to make me." The weight of his words hung in the air. The The courtroom was silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Malik's words were not just for the jury, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had been broken by the system. His defense had gone beyond law. It was a fight for dignity, for humanity, and for the truth. Everything you've done to me, everything you've thrown at me, I've endured, Malik continued, his voice growing stronger. But I'm not just enduring anymore. I'm fighting back. You think you've controlled this trial, controlled me. But I've had enough. I'm not your victim. I'm not your pawn. And this is where it ends. He paused, letting his words sink in. He knew that this was the moment. This was his final chance to make them see the truth, and he was not going to waste it. You see, it's not just about me, Malik said, his gaze sweeping across the jury. It's about every single person who has ever been silenced, oppressed, and cast aside. It's about the people who have had their voices taken from them because they weren't born into the right families or the right skin color. It's about the system that's designed to keep them down, and I'm here to tell you that we will not stay down anymore. The room was frozen in silence. The power of his words, the truth they carried, was undeniable. The jury, the judge, the audience, they could feel it. Malik wasn't just defending himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been oppressed, every person whose life had been defined by a system that refused to see their humanity. Chambers, his face flushed with anger, tried to regain control. He rose to his feet, his voice shaky as he spoke. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to turn this courtroom into a platform for his personal attacks. This trial is about facts, not emotional manipulation. Malik didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Chambers. The facts? The facts are that you've used every lie, every tactic, every biased argument to try to bury the truth. The fact is that you've been using me as an example, trying to prove that people like me don't belong in society. But you failed. The truth is right here, standing before you. He pointed to himself, and then, slowly, turned to address the entire courtroom. I am not a statistic. I am not a criminal. I am a human being. I am someone who deserves the right to live freely, to live with dignity, and no matter what you throw at me, I will not let you take that away. The room was charged with energy. Chambers stood motionless, his confidence completely shattered. For the first time, he had no words to counter Malik's truth. The defense had become the attacker, and Malik had exposed every crack in the facade of the system that had tried to tear him apart. But Malik wasn't done yet. He wasn't just going to walk away after this. He had one final point to make, the one that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of those like him. I know what you've been trying to do, Malik said, his voice growing steady, like the calm before a storm. You've been trying to break me, to make me think that I'm nothing, to make me believe that I have no value. But the truth is, you've already lost, because no matter what happens here today, you can never take away my voice, you can never take away my dignity, and you can never take away the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Malik's words hung in the air, like a challenge to the entire system. He had turned the tables. He had forced them to confront everything they had been trying to avoid. The truth could not be hidden any longer. The judge, who had been sitting quietly behind his desk, finally spoke, his voice low but resolute. The jury will now deliberate. But even as the jury left to deliberate, it was clear to everyone in the room that the trial had already shifted. Malik had done more than just fight for his freedom. He had shown the world what it meant to stand up to a broken system, to call out the injustices, and to fight for what was right. The courtroom, once a place of judgment, had become a place of revelation. The system had been exposed, and Malik, once seen as a mere victim, had become its greatest challenger. His defense was no longer just about the law. It was about something much more profound, the fight for truth, for justice, and for the future. And as Malik left the courtroom that day, head held high, there was a sense that the system had been forever changed. The truth had been spoken, and nothing, not even the most powerful forces, could ever erase it. Malik had not only defended his honor, he had sparked a revolution that would echo through the hearts of all those who had been silenced for too long. This was just the beginning.